Introducing the Institution of Surveyors of Kenya live stream and live chat. Do you have a question from any of the following areas? Land survey, valuation, building survey, land administration, engineering survey, estate agency, property management, and geospatial information management. Join the Institution of Surveyors of Kenya live stream and live chat every Friday from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m.
Welcome members to ISK Live Chat. Good afternoon. This is an event that comes to you every Friday, and today's topic is spatial data infrastructure and land management. This event is live on YouTube, live also on Facebook. We ask you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Please post your questions and comments as the live chat is going on, so that we can be able to interact and visit on this important topic, as I said, spatial data infrastructure in land management. My name is Eric Nyadimo. I'm the chair for the Geospatial Information Management Surveyors chapter within ISK. And I'm also the managing director of Orca Services Limited, which is a geospatial solutions company that has been in existence for the last 20 years or so. And I'm also privileged to be lecturing part-time at the University of Nairobi. And in addition to that, I'm the vice chair of the Lands and Physical Planning Sector Board within the Kenya Private Sector Alliance. I wish to ask you members to join me in this important topic that I will be explaining, demystifying, making you to understand the usefulness of spatial data infrastructure and how it actually applies into land management. All right, so I'll start by looking at the definition of spatial data infrastructure. Then we look at the purpose of having spatial data infrastructure, and we see how this relates to what we do on a day-to-day basis. Now, spatial data has been referred to as data which has a location or a positional element. And the infrastructure refers to the environment that is able to provide one with access to the spatial information using a minimum set of standards or protocols or specifications. Therefore, when you talk about spatial data infrastructure, or SDI in short, it refers to a relevant collection of technologies, policies, and institutional arrangements that facilitate the availability and access to spatial data. Now, what is the purpose of having a spatial data infrastructure? One of the critical purposes of having an SDI is to be able to save time, effort, and money in accessing spatial data and using it responsibly. And why do I say this? We find that if we have an agreed infrastructure for sharing data, then we will avoid instances of duplication of data. Now, if we have instances of duplicating data, it often results into redundancy, it results into wastage of resources, and therefore having that kind of an infrastructure where we have agreed that if you are the institution that is generating cadastral data, then you are the one that is actually maintaining that data, and the rest, like say the valuers or utility companies like Kenya Power or Nairobi Water, are then having access to this information and using it. That then facilitates the exchange of data, exchange of information, which makes it much more easier to be able to interact and to be able to obtain information when somebody needs it. So the purpose of spatial data infrastructure can be summarized into three. One, to facilitate access to data. Two, to enable responsible use of data. And three, to avail data at affordable prices. And I will be explaining this in a few. Now, why do we say that we need to facilitate access to data? We need to let the users know what information is available. For example, if valuers are interested in a given land parcel, they need to know what land parcels are available. They need to know where that data can actually be found. They need to know what are the conditions of access. Do they need to pay something? How do they need to, how can they use it? And if they have to pay, how much will it cost? When we talk about responsible use of data as a purpose or a function of SDI, we imply an obligation on the part of the data suppliers to include qualitative information about the data so that a user can be able to interrogate and find out how that data fits in to his or her application. The other aspect is about affordable prices. So this signifies the degree of price differentiation. So the idea here is to facilitate data sharing. The idea here is not to prevent people from accessing data because the data costs a lot of money. If we go on further, we shall see that when you're talking about spatial data infrastructure, you need to be able to define fundamental data sets. And we could talk about land parcels, and we'd say that this is a fundamental data set because the valuers, the surveyors, the physical planners, the engineers need to use this information from time to time. And therefore, the access to this information becomes very necessary. And the pricing at which that data is availed should not be to such an extent that it deters others from having that access. And that's why we are talking about affordability. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the data has to be priced, but it could be availed in one fashion or another. So there is a common spatial data foundation in terms of this data that is going to be shared, being organized in terms of layers and in terms of scales, and could be available for a given geographic area or a region. So it is important that when you're providing information about the data, you relate it to those kind of aspects. Now, as I said before, when we talk about sharing of data, we can define fundamental data sets and we can also define thematic data sets. And usually, fundamental data sets are availed or provided by government, like in this case, the National Mapping Agency. And that kind of data should be readily accessible, should be available at no or little cost, and should be updated according to a common accepted standard. So if we talk about land parcels again, and we find that this is the basis of the information that we need to make as professionals, then we need to know when that land has been subdivided, we need to know when it has been given a new number, and so on and so forth. And that's why you're talking about that data being updated time and time again. And then of course now we have the thematic data sets, which could be generated by other participants who are not necessarily government, but who are adding value to that kind of information. So when we talk of an ideal spatial data infrastructure, we are saying that we need data that can be produced by one organization and that can be shared or integrated with different kind of data sets. And then the people who are working within this particular infrastructure would be responsible enough so that they're not only generating the data like what we would expect from Survey of Kenya, but they're also maintaining and also distributing the data widely in a variety of forms that can be accessed by people working within government and within the private sector. So the reason why we advocate for this kind of an infrastructure is in order for the government and the private sector to come together so that government can be able to take advantage of the private sector capabilities available at reasonable prices rather than maintaining dedicated capabilities, because you know that the cost of generating, maintaining and distributing data need to be justified in terms of the public benefits of private gains. In addition, also, it is necessary to bring organizations together, as I've said before, to remove overlaps and to remove duplications. If we pick boundary data, for example, and we say that the National Mapping Agency is going to generate the boundary information, then we also have another organization that is generating boundary information. What we would end up with is that there would be a duplication of data, and people would start questioning and wondering which data set is the correct one. So the ideal SDI assumes or postulates that the person who is generating the data, who needs to maintain the data, is the one who has actually the capability and the muscle to be able to capture that data. So this idea about SDI is a concept that started quite some time back, now over 20 years, to be able to create an environment that could enable a wide variety of users to be able to access and to retrieve data sets within a region. It could be a country, it could be like a continent wide, it could be within a county, for example, if you look at the case that we have within Kenya. And the development of this kind of an infrastructure needs to be done through a cooperation of the various stakeholders. You'll find that it is not easy to come up with an SDI just as a single organization. Because if you look at the situation that we have, say for example in Kenya, we have valuers generating valuation information. We have physical planners, we have civil engineers, we have surveyors. So each and every of these professionals is generating a given type of information, and this information, if it is availed within a defined infrastructure, then that is what results into what is called a spatial data infrastructure. So the critical issue is knowledge about the types of data that are available, the location, the quality, and how people can be able to access that particular data. Of course, the fact that we can say that we are successful in instituting an SDI when there is widespread use and appreciation by various users, that they can be able to access the information when they need to be able to access it. As we have said, that there are a number of requirements when it comes to developing a spatial data infrastructure. You need to have the people who are producing the data. You need to have the people who are using the data. But in addition to that, you also need to have the legislative framework, because for us to be able to share, to be able to agree on the pricing, we need to have that legislative angle so that it becomes very clear and people's rights are protected, so that you don't have a situation where I take your data and use it, but I do not acknowledge that I actually got that data from yourself. And in addition to that, we also have the telecommunication providers, the IT. You cannot have a successful spatial data infrastructure without that medium that facilitates communication, and in this particular case, that medium is the internet. Now, there are different components of spatial data infrastructure. One is the institutional framework. Two is what I defined before and talked about, fundamental data sets. Three is the metadata, that is a description about the data, the qualitative information. Four is on the technical standards. Five is on how people will access the data. And fifth, of course, is the people who are behind the aspect of requiring that data and who need to be able to use that data. Now, the development of a spatial data infrastructure requires the right policies, requires the right legislation, and requires that institutional framework. It is therefore important to formulate an information policy or legislation that is relating the right to access information, the use of the spatial data, copyright, and data pricing. Now, as we have said before, there is what we call metadata, and metadata is basically the qualitative information about the data. It describes the data. So if you have got land parcels, you need to be able to tell us that these land parcels were generated in which year. Is it 2003? Is it 2004? Who did the work? What are the accuracy requirements? If it is boundary information, when was the boundary captured? How was it captured? Was it through aerial photography? Was it through ground survey? Was it through tracing of existing features on the ground? So that kind of information needs to be provided so that you, as a user who wants to then make use of that information, you can be able to read that information and you can be able to decide that this is the correct data that I need to be able to use. So metadata becomes a very critical component of spatial data infrastructure. We've talked about technical standards. And technical standards, one of the major aspects is the geo-referencing. Because for us to be able to share data, we have said that the data that we are concerning ourselves with is the spatial data. And spatial data has to occupy location. So geo-referencing becomes critical. Other aspects of technical standards are on things like data content, data resolution, and as I've said, metadata. Now, we have international organizations that have come and define certain standards for sharing data. And these include the International Standards Organization or the Open Geospatial Consortium, which have brought out elaborate standards that people need to follow when they are sharing data. And different countries have to choose whether they will use standards from the US, or they'll use the ISO standard, or they will follow the OGC standards. Now, one other thing in terms of access is internet. Without internet, we cannot have access. And you see, you may be sitting in Nairobi, but accessing data that is in Kisumu. You don't have to go to Kisumu physically. So that's the critical aspect when it comes to communication. And there are different types of spatial data infrastructures that have been established across the world. The success stories. In Kenya, we have been working on that journey for some time now. One other thing that we need to recognize when you're talking about spatial data infrastructure is the people, you and myself, the people who generate the data, the people who need to use this data. And when you're talking about land information, you're talking about financial institutions, you're talking about tax authorities, you're talking about utility companies. They all need to make use of the data. And in the case, or in our case here, the smallest unit of data that we are talking about is a land parcel, and all information is related to that particular land parcel in terms of who is the owner of that parcel, what is the acreage of that parcel, what are the dimensions of that parcel, who was the previous owner, looking at the history behind that data, where did that land parcel come from, what was there before, and so on and so forth. This becomes critical information. What is the value of that land? Becomes critical for us to be able to make decisions. What is the zoning that would influence the development conditions that are associated with that particular land parcel? So the people are critical components of the spatial data infrastructure. We have talked generally about the spatial data infrastructure, looking at the definitions, looking at the purpose, looking at that ideal spatial data infrastructure. If we now narrow down and we talk about the Kenyan case and talk about our dream to establish the Kenya National Spatial Data Infrastructure, KNSDI, and we find that this is a journey that started as early as 2006, when the government of Kenya with other stakeholders came together and started the formulation of the Kenya National Spatial Data Infrastructure with help from the JICA, that is a Japanese International Cooperation Agency. The idea at that particular time was to come up with the Kenya National Spatial Data Infrastructure to be a leading national infrastructure for access and use of geospatial information in decision making at local, regional, and national levels for sustainable development and as part of the wider global spatial data infrastructure. So there was a draft policy that was developed through a multi-sectoral consultative approach with various stakeholders from the public, private, academia, and civil society. And it was thought that this draft policy would be able to facilitate the production, use, management, and sharing of quality geospatial information for sustainable development within Kenya and also within East Africa and wider within the region, and of course worldwide. That this kind of policy would be able to promote the development of information markets, right? Because remember, initially we talked about access and we talked about price. So that's an information market to enable transparency and participatory governance. It was thought that KNSDI will be able to benefit all sectors, from agriculture to natural resources, to health, to education, to environment, to security, and to tourism. And closer home, of course, to land information management. So you find that there were various stakeholders who are involved in the setup and in the management of KNSDI, with that thought that the Secretariat for KNSDI would be at the Survey of Kenya as a national mapping agency. And now, this spatial data infrastructure was made in such a way that you have defined fundamental data sets, you've got thematic data sets, standards brought out, issues about data and information ownership, issues about custodianship, issues about confidentiality, privacy, liability, and copyright. And the idea was that this kind of infrastructure would be under the Ministry of Lands and would be managed through a National Executive Council with a National Steering Committee, and then with different working groups on various thematic areas. So this is still a dream. The GIS chapter has looked at that draft policy that was worked out in 2008, 2009, and we have improved on it. And we would want to, at some point, of course, share this with the general membership of the Institution of Surveyors of Kenya, and then advocate for the same to the various stakeholders, of course, talking about the government and other stakeholders, to see whether this dream can continue, because it's a valid dream, and it would actually result into a lot of cost savings by people who are producing data, by people who need to be able to access data. And this issue about spatial data infrastructure also relates and mirrors quite well with the formulation of the National Land Information Management System, so that the National Land Information Management System would be part and parcel of this kind of a spatial data infrastructure. Because in addition to the land information management system, you can also have utility information, and all these things can actually be brought together to be able to facilitate this kind of an interaction. So this infrastructure would be just like any other national infrastructure, like education, health, transport, and it would be in use by professionals and the general citizens, with the need for training and capacity building. And of course, it would require funding. It would require an action plan. It would require a secretariat to be able to implement it. So ladies and gentlemen, we have looked deeply into this issue. Again, as I said, if you have any comments, you can be able to post, and we can be able to react to some of the questions that you may be having on YouTube, on Facebook Live. And once again, I'm saying good afternoon, members. Thank you very much for listening in to us today on our regular Friday feature. And this today we are talking about the spatial data infrastructure in land management. Thank you very much, and looking forward to interact with you further. Asante.
Introducing the Institution of Surveyors of Kenya live stream and live chat. Do you have a question from any of the following areas? Land survey, valuation, building survey, land administration, engineering survey, estate agency, property management, and geospatial information management. Join the Institution of Surveyors of Kenya live stream and live chat every Friday from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m.